Howdy, I'm George Friday. I'm the national staff person for United for Peace and Justice, and we're so excited that you're joining us tonight for this discussion. Um, and we're honored to have co-sponsors for this event. Uh, Brooklyn for Peace, Historians for Peace and Democracy, Peace Action, Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives, Massachusetts Peace Action New York State, and Veterans for Peace. Um, we're sure that tonight will be informative and wonderful. Okay, so Andy, I'm going to hand it to you to introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, I'm Andy Lichterman, and I'm a member of the Coordinating Committee of United for Peace and Justice. And my home organization is Western States Legal Foundation, based in Oakland, California. So welcome to our discussion with Professor Carolyn Rusti Eisenberg over her book, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, which was the winner of the Bancroft Prize for Distinguished Works in American History. Rusti is a professor of U.S. History and Foreign Relations at Hofstra University. And in addition to Fire and Rain, she's the author of Drawing the Line, the American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944 to 1949. Rusti always has combined her teaching and scholarship with political organizing and action, from advising members of Congress to work in local and national peace organizations. She is a co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace and served for a number of years on the coordinating committee of United for Peace and Justice. So Rusti and I will have an initial conversation about the book and then open it up for questions. Please submit your questions in the chat, and please be sure that your microphone is set on mute. So Rusti, this book is really a remarkable piece of work. It reflects an enormous amount of research, ranging from declassified documents to extensive interviews with public figures in the US and Vietnam, Vietnam War era journalists, veterans, and the vast secondary literature on the war and its context. So when did you start working on this project, and what motivated you to take it on?
Well, as I think I mentioned to you before we went public, I've distorted when I started so many times. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I believe it was 1999. And it really was a response mostly to my teaching, because I hadn't exactly planned to write another book. But I was teaching about the war in Vietnam, and my students had a lot of questions. And in particular, they found it very difficult to understand the Nixon period of the war. Because what the students kept saying was, he's a great politician here. He's so smart about everything. Why didn't he just say, after the Tet Offensive had shown the weakness of the U.S. position, why didn't he just say, this was a big mistake by my predecessors, and we're going to end it as quickly as possible, and just leave blaming them? And my students kept finding that difficult. And I, of course, gave them a lot of readings to do. And every single reading I gave them, they found the fallacy in those readings. So I would say that particular question was very salient. And actually that question of why did they continue, depending on what was going on in the world when I was teaching, it was different. So after the Iraq War was going on for a number of years, that whole question about Vietnam sort of comes back with Iraq, right? Because he's saying the same thing. This is a flop. There are no weapons of mass destruction. Why doesn't somebody just end this thing and get out? So there was a kind of vital discussion that was going on. My students had other things. And, a second question, which also kept coming back to me, was, how come if they're waging war against Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, and all these people are dying, how do you explain Nixon going to China? How do you explain the summits in Moscow? How do those things fit together? They don't make sense. And then I would say a third consideration when I was starting this project was also a result of my classroom teaching, which is that when students read books about policy, or my students in any case, about policy, and this person said something to that person, they quickly get really bored with it. And what's interesting to them are the human consequences of any of these policies. So one of my very important goals in starting this process with this project was really to find a way to do those two things at the same time, to do a very serious look at the policy process itself, but also to try to make it clear what those policies resulted in. So all of those things were in the background, and they kind of remained actually as important guides.
Well, so you were probably a few years into this project
Yes.
at the time of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. And aside from getting kind of a lot of your time consumed by anti-war work, did the Iraq war just sort of intensify the path that you were on, or did it change your thinking about the project in any way?
I don't know if I would say it changed the thinking about my project, except that it really interfered with it because you can't do this work, this research, by being in 100 meetings. I would say in some ways, it's the opposite, that what I was learning from my research actually to some degree informed some of my activism. I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship with that, but I would say that was more the impact of reading all those secret documents all the time. It made me see things a little bit differently.
Well, say a bit about that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said. I mean, one very important thing, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and I was also involved for UFPJ in the legislative work. But one of the ways I really was impacted by my research, and it just kept growing, it wasn't shrinking, was once I started reading all these top secret everythings, which I was what was involved in this, it was thousands and thousands of pages. I guess one thing that was very important is that I really ended up feeling that the anti-war movement was much more influential in what happened, especially in those Nixon years. It was much more influential than I had thought. And in general, the people that I knew at the time, I think we were always, there'd be actions, exciting demonstrations, sit-ins or whatever. And then somehow, you ended up feeling, well, that didn't really make a difference. That didn't make a difference. But once I was actually reading those high-level documents, I actually changed, and I really began to see that the anti-war movement was having a much greater impact in the internal processes of government than I really had thought at the time. So that was pretty important. And a second thing that I discovered or thought from looking at documents that I had never seen before is actually the importance of working with Congress. And I have a lot of things to say about that, but I mean, just as a general point, is that for most of the time that the anti-war movement was growing, and I would include here, really from 66 right up to through 72. I think that, some folks did congressional work, other folks didn't want to do congressional work, but I think there was a generalized demoralization about that, which is, we go to this person, we get that resolution introduced, the resolution fails, it never makes any difference. That was much more what, at least in the land that I was in, that was much more the feeling. But when I started to read the record, even there, I actually got a more complex, I think, understanding of what it meant to do congressional work and what was possible and what could be achieved. I'm saying that without denigrating the other ways that people were involved. I mean, I think it's extraordinarily important that you had these huge events that kept happening. And even though there was often, kind of a clunk at the end, oh my God, we've now got 100,000 people and it's not making it, and the policy keeps going. Nixon's not listening. That was kind of the feeling about so many things. You get excited about it, and then it was flat. So in saying that, I got a stronger idea about why congressional work was important. That's not to in any way deny the other aspect of that, which was building a mass movement and having events where large numbers of people were visible and mobilized. I mean, those things, really went together.
Yeah, and let's sort of take a path through the kind of main narrative line of the book, and then come back again to that question of the impact of the anti-war movement and its relationship to the legislative work and so forth. So again, you know, writing history, particularly big history like this, you always have to choose some narrative route through the complex terrain, you know. And you've told us quite a bit about why you chose this kind of for the sort of top level strand, this personality centered account focusing on Nixon and Kissinger and the decisions they made and their impact. And as a counterpoint, you have these threads about the anti-war movement and about the impact of the war on the ground, both in Southeast Asia and here at home. But the central focus of a lot of the book is Nixon, Kissinger, and their decision making. So I'm interested in this. This mainly came out of because that's the questions that your students were asking you about. Or were there other reasons you saw this as the best way to organize the material you were finding and doing all this research and the new declassified documents and so on?
Well, you know, for anybody who writes a book that goes on forever, you know, there are very diverse motivations that could come in. And I think it's probably fair to say that, you know, for many conversations with students, I really did have in my head the importance of somehow or other connecting these policies to what actually was going on. You know, that really was a purpose. And, you know, I would look for things, but, you know, very soon when I had this methodology that I wanted to, like, you know, say something about what was actually happening in the field. And then in a way, I got carried away by it. You know, in other words, like it began to seem so relevant, like to juxtapose the policy to what was happening to actual people. You know, that, I mean, so that at a certain point, I couldn't just write about the policy anymore. But I was looking for ways to convey to readers what was going on the ground. Now, obviously, this book could have been 5,000 pages instead of 500. Thank you to an editor. But, you know, at some point, my own angle of vision was like, you know, what is going on? You know, all these people, they're sitting in the room, they have these very, you know, stultifying kind of conversations about this option and that option, you know, and I really just started myself to feel claustrophobic just looking at that and just say, well, okay, how can I see what is happening, you know, outside of these rooms? And so I you know, I gave a lot of thought to what I was going to look for in order to convey that, you know, and there were certain kinds of documents that were important. So just to give one illustration of that, of many, as some of the folks on this Zoom probably know, that for a good part of the Vietnam War, the American Friends Service Committee had a rehab center that they were running in Quang Ngai province through a lot of the war with some very short interruption. So you had all these people from, you know, from Quaker organization on the ground dealing with regular people all the time. And so I can't even remember who put this bee in my bonnet, but I went to the archives, you know, of the American Friends. And this is, of course, before email. And I found there, you know, vast correspondence of the people who are working on the ground in this rehab center and what they were seeing. And it was so incredible to read those things. It's not like they controlled the larger truth either. But what was really remarkable was the contrast between what these people who were living there in that province were experiencing, what they were seeing, and what these people back in Washington were seeing. And, you know, so, you know, that's one illustration, but, you know, I was fortunate, just as one other example of this, I was very fortunate. Some folks here may know Fred Bramfman, who was in Laos and who ended up meeting the people who had been, you know, bombed on the Plain of Jars. And he wrote a book, you know, on the Plain of Jars. But anyway, he was good enough to share a lot of his personal archive with me. So again, it made it possible for me to see, you know, something about what was people's experience when the U.S. under various presidents, expanded their activities in Laos. And finally, if I just throw in one other thing, in a way, my effort to try to find out, what the specific experience was of people, it actually changed how I thought about policymakers, because it made it clear what the level of obliviousness actually was. And I think probably, again, a lot of the older folks, my contemporaries on this call, I mean, this isn't like an amazing thought, right? It's like, what are these people thinking? But it actually, putting some content on it, made it actually seem much clearer. And if I just elaborate for a minute about this, early in the Nixon administration, when Daniel Ellsberg was a good friend of Kissinger's, which, as we know, is a friendship that didn't end well. But when he was Kissinger's pal, and Kissinger was about to become national security advisor, Ellsberg gave him some advice. And he said, Henry, if you're going to be the national security advisor, you're going to be seeing all these classified records all the time. And you're going to start feeling like you have the truth because you have all these classified materials and nobody else has anything to say. And you'll become incapable of listening or paying attention to people who are outside of that, not the writers of these memoirs, but other kinds of people. You're going to start deciding, oh, they don't really know what's going on. I know what's going on. And he said, and Henry, if you let that happen to you, you're going to become a kind of a moron, which I stole from him for one of my chapters, a kind of a moron. Because that's, in a sense, what Ellsberg was talking about is to a large extent what was happening, which is that the people in positions of power could not learn from anybody beside each other. So if you're getting, some elaborate report from, the MACV in Saigon, the military headquarters, and they're sending you charts and statistics, and you sort of, oh, right, okay, now I know what's going on. But then, you could pick up the New York Times and find that there was a reporter who was on the ground who was saying something different. But the people who are making that policy, they weren't interested in that. They couldn't learn from it. And so one of the consequences of it ultimately is that they ended up making some very stupid decisions. And it actually becomes clear when you look that that closed loop around them of what you can know and what you're going to pay attention to has a profound effect on how they function.
Yeah, one of the things in the book that really jumped out at me on these questions of information flow was the extent to which there were cabinet officials such as Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, who were pushing for a speedier end to U.S. involvement, or at least a speedier withdrawal of U.S. troops. And the response to this by Nixon and Kissinger was that they often tried to cut the top levels of the State and Defense Department and all that expertise in Washington at the top levels of the state and defense departments out of the information and decision-making loop, instead dealing directly with the U.S. command in Vietnam and the Joint Chiefs who were opposed to the troop drawdowns and committed to the war. So what consequences did that have for the way that they conducted the war?
Well, if I may, I want to say something about dear old Melvin Laird, who I have to say, with somebody, if at the time you're in the anti-war movement, he always looked kind of sinister, and he was just considered as one of the routine bad guys. But what in my book I actually have a lot about Melvin Laird. He's not really exactly a hero, but he's very significant because he was Secretary of Defense. But really what's important about Melvin Laird is really interesting. He wasn't a career military person. He was a politician. He had been a Republican leader in the House, and Nixon chose him because he thought correctly that Laird could, get the budgets through and would they be able to wheel and deal on Capitol Hill, which was correct up to a point. But what's interesting about Melvin Laird in particular is he's a politician. He's not a liberal. He's certainly not a radical. He is a politician. And as a politician, he is acutely aware of what's happening with the anti-war movement. And particularly, think he's from Wisconsin. I'm right, Wisconsin is just blowing up, through this whole time. But not just that. And of course, Laird's kids are in the anti-war movement. But the point is that Laird, like other politicians in Washington, even Republican politicians, they are tuned into the anti-war movement and its growth and its power and its influence. So he's come as he's a Secretary of Defense, but he really, from the get-go, his goal is to get the U.S. troops out. And his big adversary is actually Kissinger. And I realize I'm not answering your question, but one of the things that's interesting, and it does bear on the flow of information, is that as time goes on, and as you know, the fact is U.S. policy is failing in Vietnam. I mean, it was failing in 1968 too, but by 1970, 71, it's really failing. And so more and more people are getting cut out of the loop. And part of what happens, which is sort of fascinating in this way, is the person that Nixon and Kissinger decide is the only person they really trust is Al Haig. And Al Haig distinguished himself when Ronald Reagan got shot, and he announced that I'm in charge there, and everybody said, what a presumptuous, arrogant guy he is. But I could understand where he was coming from, because he's really elevated. He hadn't even been an important military person, but he becomes elevated by Nixon and Kissinger as the person that is going to cut around certain bureaucrats and deal directly with the military. And he becomes one of the only people that they actually can listen to. So this comes up in a number, I talk about it in very specific situations in the book, but there are various things that go awry, and they're trying to figure out what's true. I mean, at some point, Kissinger can't even get anybody to tell him accurately about the weather. He just goes crazy. Why can't someone make it clear about the weather? Well, they can't, because of the way you handle information. And Al Haig has to tell him the weather's bad. But so Haig becomes a very crucial person. And who gets cut out of this? It's not just Laird, right? Early on, Kissinger, and I think I'm seeing some folks on this call who probably have better knowledge even than I do about this, but Kissinger had a civilian staff in the National Security Council, people he had brought in. And those people initially, seem like they're going to be brilliant and add to the Nixon administration's, luminous quality. But those people get marginalized too. Mm. So out of all these very knowledgeable people that are on Kissinger's staff,
please mute yourself.
Just a second of it.
Anyway, real quickly, despite the fact that there are some civilian experts on Kissinger's staff who he has brought in from the outside, but partly because of their expertise, Al Haig rises from that whole group, and he becomes the person that they can most listen to.
Well, circling back to those basic questions that your students were asking you, that in some ways set you down this path of pursuing the Nixon and Kissinger phase of the war. Given the sort of intrinsic information flow problems, the military is on the ground, they have control of the information and what's going on there. And any president coming in would have faced those same problems in terms of really getting good information. Your students were saying, what prevented Nixon from finding a way to end the war relatively quickly, a year or two, placing the blame for Vietnam on the previous Democratic Party administrations and moving on? So how might things have turned out really differently if Humphrey were elected? I mean, would they have been more likely to end the war sooner? Would they have been less likely to have intensified the wider war in Laos and Cambodia? I know it's impossible to know these things, but what was distinctive about this Nixon Kissinger?
Many historians, it's a very good question, Andrew. And there's certainly many historians that think that if Hubert Humphrey had been elected, that this might have gone somewhat differently. I'm kind of a skeptic about that. I mean, Humphrey, at one time was a genuine liberal in terms of both his domestic concerns and his international concerns. But he had really become a cheerleader for the war, and his own identity was tied up with that. And part of what I ended up, and I'm trying to find a simple way to say it, but and I can't have another 500 pages, is the power of the blob. Which I really, I was trying to think, when did people start talking about, how did that phrase come in, the blob, as a euphemism for the whole kind of national security apparatus that there is, because I don't think there was the blob idea back then. But I think as I was reading, these documents, I was really shocked by the power of the blob. When Kissinger and Nixon first come in, one of the things they do with the help of Daniel Ellsberg is that they send questionnaires to everybody, in all these national security bureaucracies, asking a zillion questions that Daniel had to help formulate, because they wanted to know what people were thinking. And they, got massive responses. And truthfully, there was, from these bureaucracies that are in place there, nobody was advocating just get the hell out. Nobody. There was no voice that was saying that. And so for people like Nixon and Kissinger, who had made their careers as kind of, Cold War Orthodox people, for them at that time in 1969 to have gone up against all of this opinion would really have been, very, very difficult. And I'm not sure that Hubert Humphrey would have done much better. Because again, it was very striking to read the record, and there were definitely skeptics there. There's no question that there were skeptics. On the other hand, the military felt that Tet had been a big victory for the United States and South Vietnam, so they want to press ahead, with that. So I don't know how easily or how readily Humphrey would have, gone up against them. And just to be a little tangential, I've been thinking about this with respect to Kamala Harris. Right, who, just to venture a personal opinion, but in her debate, and also, especially in her debate, what she had to say about national security and foreign policy could have been written by Liz Cheney. And that doesn't necessarily prove that that's how she will act as president. But, what I was thinking is she has been immersed. This has come through. I think, Joe Gerson has made a very convincing case about she has been immersed in this whole decision-making apparatus within the national security state. She's coming out of that. And it's actually very challenging to imagine how, if she gets elected president of the United States, how ready she's going to be to challenge the kind of things that, become orthodoxy, right? Iran is, the worst enemy in the world, and Russia's a vast danger, and China is a danger, all of this nonsense that's coming out that's very overwrought. I don't know that she's going to go up against it that well either. And I'm not saying that to be, just negative. I think ultimately, in terms of any kind of change, what will be important is the anti-war movement. That if it turns out that there is a growing and significant mobilization of people who are challenging these policies, that could make a difference. In the absence of that mobilization, I don't feel particularly optimistic. And again, just to go back to Nixon and Kissinger, these are conforming guys. For all their little personality quirks, they're and they're not stupid either. They're smart guys. And everything was telling them to keep going, to keep trying this thing and that thing, and that somehow or other they're going to get a deal that will be better for the US than what seems available at the moment.
Well, turning to sort of the even broader foreign policy canvas, particularly the rapprochement with China and the beginnings of détente and arms control progress with the Soviet Union. Here again, how much different would that likely have been under a different administration? The initiatives for improved relations to a considerable extent, as you write in the book, came from the governments of the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. The ping-pong diplomacy, the arms control negotiations, the process that really started to lead up to the SALT talks limiting nuclear arms began during the Johnson administration. So, is
Well,
that
this is
fated
really,
to be, or
you know, when I started my project, one of the things is that people said you'll never see the transcripts of those negotiations. But actually they became available, including, to everyone's utter amazement, the Russian side of it. In other words, the document that no one ever thought you'd see, which is that the Russian documents were translated and became available to an American, audience. So when Kissinger meets Dobrynin, we actually now have the notes on the US side. We also have Dobrynin's notes. So, I mean, that added another 10 years to the project, but there was really a lot to be learned. And I don't really have a very quick summary of that, but part of what I would try to say is that, weirdly enough, they ended up being much softer on the Chinese and on the Russians than would have ever happened, was it not for the fact that their Vietnam policy is a flop, that it's failing, right? And one of the things I try to show in the book is it's not like things aren't static, that there's a flow to events. So they come in, they have these things, oh, we'll go into Cambodia, that'll be helpful, all sorts of ideas that they might have about what'll work. And nothing is really working. And a big factor for them, and this is also relevant to Iraq, as well as to them, is that Americans are dying. While Nixon and Kissinger spend their first year, sort of dithering around and trying to figure out what exactly they're going to be doing, 10,000 Americans died. And that becomes another fact. Like, why did 10,000 Americans die? And they say it, Nixon particularly, but the normal people are going to ask the question, why did we sacrifice these people and come up with nothing? And again, early on, they think they actually are going to come up with something. They think that there are some positive results that can materialize, and they were wrong. And so as you're moving now towards the second part of the administration, Nixon is facing re-election, and the Vietnam policy is shredded with nothing good to, that's workable. Yes, he's in that. Part of what then happens is that relations with the Soviet Union and China actually become a way out for the two of them, which is kind of a mind-blowing fact, which I didn't think at first. But they really want those relationships. And so the question is, why do they want those relationships? Because we forget this, but if you looked into the country in 1971, for example, Nixon hadn't accomplished that much, right? But partly Nixon recognizes that if he can go to China, if that could happen, it initially seemed kind of miraculous. If he can have a summit, in Moscow, that these are things that will be extraordinarily popular with the American public. So there's a profound political motivation, which only grows as the situation in Southeast Asia gets worse. The second thing that is very important, and again, I didn't start with a preconception about this, it's really what I learned, is the extent to which they really want the Russians and the Chinese to pressure North Vietnam to give them a peace agreement that would at least seem and maybe be, somewhat acceptable to the American public. And they really are asking for help. So just one example of what I'm saying here is that there are numbers of occasions where, for example, Kissinger is talking to Chinese leaders, and he does not use a US translator. Think about that. He uses the Chinese translator. Why would that be? Because if you use a translator, that person comes from the State Department. And he very often did not want the state, especially when he's dealing with China, did not want the State Department to even really know what he was doing. And similarly, just as another example of this, in the final phases of Kissinger's negotiation with North Vietnam, and I'm speaking now about, maybe October through December of 1972, that whole time period, he hides the negotiation transcripts from the State Department. He literally will not let the Secretary of State or his people see what is going on. He's giving those records to Dobrynin, to the Russian ambassador. Now, why is that happening? Is that because he's selling us out? No, but it is because he still has this idea that he can get the Russian ambassador to help him out of the quandary that he's in. So that's really important. And as a consequence of this, he makes concessions to the Russians in arms control, for example, which turn out to really alienate, once these deals, become public, it actually ends up alienating a lot of Cold Warrior type people who say, the SALT process is terrible and Kissinger has bargained away our national security. Well, he hadn't done that, but he had made very significant concessions to the Russians. He also leads the Chinese to feel that the US doesn't care about Taiwan at all, which is another thing, because now, of course, it would appear that our commitment to Taiwan is, has been for all eternity. But if you look at his negotiations with the Chinese, you would really come away with the impression that the US was losing interest in Taiwan, understood that China had a right to determine its destiny there. So these were all things that I didn't really think before I was actually reading these transcripts. But part of what it highlights is how fake the point about credibility is, right? That what's the justification for fighting in all these places? Well, theoretically, you're showing your credibility to these very dangerous enemies, right? That's what you're doing. But you're not really showing your credibility to them when you're going behind the back of the State Department and you're making concessions that your arms control people don't even know that you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of content, obviously, to be added to this. You're making a big generalization. But I think that to some extent, their desperation is one of the reasons why they do something good. But it also means that some of the good things they did actually turn out to not be on a firm foundation. And later hawks come along and undo some of the good things that they managed.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it strikes me that the concessions they made in arms control with the Soviet Union in the long run end up getting lost in the noise of the second arms race under Reagan.
Right.
But perhaps more consequential was that the US position on Taiwan sovereignty issues kind of gets decided in this sort of just along the way while thinking about something else. And in a lot of ways, that's had a more permanent effect.
You mean the ambiguity that's surrounding it?
Yeah.
It did. I mean, that again, it's a funny position to take because I think probably most of the folks that are, listening, right, that we considered that improvement of relations with the Russians and the Chinese was desirable. And if we look at what's going on right now, I think it's still the case that it would be better to have diplomacy and to figure out some way of settling conflict than, just billions and billions of new nuclear weapons. I mean, so it's not like I think it's terrible that he did it, although I do think that the very sneaky, dishonest way that Kissinger went about his negotiations, and arms control is a very good example of this, had the effect of alienating people who then become mortal enemies. And so to some very significant degree, if we look forward to Ronald Reagan becoming the president, and who were the people behind Reagan,
right.
Some of the important hawks are the people that are still, angry at the way that Kissinger had handled détente and had handled, in specific, the SALT agreement. So, there's some other, unfortunate, byproducts of that.
Right. So on to the threads that you weave as a counterpoint to this Nixon and Kissinger narrative, the emergence of the anti-war movement and its impact, and the effects of the war on people all across Southeast Asia. And these themes were grounded in numerous interviews with participants, including a lot of interviews in Vietnam.
Mhm.
Also American aid workers, veterans, anti-war activists, and so forth. So can you tell us about a few of those conversations that you found particularly illuminating or surprising?
Um, I can't single out, I actually think you're asking probably about two things at once. So one is about, the anti-war movement and the role that it played. And the other has to do
Well,
with
we're
what's
going to
going
come
on.
back to the anti-war movement and the role that it played again, but I'm asking more in terms of, these are the on the ground stories that you're reading about the impacts, and whether there is anything that, given that you lived through the Vietnam War period and have been, thinking continuously about these issues since, were there things in these interviews that you said, wow, that
I don't feel like I said wow, especially on the Vietnamese side of that. I mean, in some ways, the most important effect of going to Vietnam, or a major effect, was seeing the place. Was actually, giving some reality to what this thing was that we were always talking about. Like, what does this place look like? And, so that in many ways, the physical experience of going around and looking at these different places, which had been sort of, in the news, but had never actually seen, was really, some of the most dramatic experiences, because part of what it illuminated was how crazy certain things were. So my husband was with me. I mean, there are times you're looking at things and, we're saying, oh my God, like, what were they thinking? So if you go to, and there are probably folks on this, on this Zoom have seen Vietnam. If you go and look at the tunnels, for example, which extend, for miles, and you realize that there are thousands of people living in these tunnels, and they have, like, levels of the tunnels, and I know tunnels has become a problematic word given Gaza, but anyhow, that the degree of organization that existed, in so many places in South Vietnam, it just made you see how impossible what the Americans were trying to do. At one point there were the tunnels, so it actually made my writing just like more in reality. Also, just talking to people, who, what their experience had been. And it was interesting, especially like one of the places that we went, which we were there for a very short time, was in Tay Ninh province, which is right on the border with Cambodia. And I just wanted to go there, and partly because Nick Turst, journalist, said just go there. So we were there, and it was just remarkable. We thought we were there for like 3 hours or something. But what was remarkable was when we were there, then they said, oh, well, they were going to do a little dinner. Well, it turned out like the whole town came out for this dinner. It was like a huge dinner. And just person after person, first of all, people were very annoyed with us that we weren't going to stay, because person after person wanted to tell their story and what had happened to them and what had happened to their relatives and what had happened to their children. So some of these things that you talk about like very abstractly, like, oh, 100 dead here, whatever, when you're seeing actual people who lived through these things, that was like very, it was very extraordinary. One of the things is I interviewed a bunch of people in Da Nang, and many of those people were veterans. And they were describing, I learned a lot about what was happening in Da Nang from having those conversations. But at one point in the conversation, one of the veterans said, we were so close to the American soldiers that we could smell their cigarettes. And when they dropped chocolate on the ground, we would pick it up. And so then the person looks at me and he said, well, I bet you don't exactly believe what I'm telling you. I really didn't know what I believed. But anyway, so they arranged for us to go to this village that was right on the border of where the, American Air Base had been. And I mean, where the American Air Base had been was flattened, it was just grass. now. No planes, no bombs, no nothing. So we're right on the edge of the grass, and there are these little homes that are right by the grass. And so we go marching up to one of the homes, and there's like an 80-year-old guy who greets us, and he takes out a chisel. So, we just, well, he's kind of like stones leading up to his house, takes out a chisel and begins carving. And what you see, lo and behold, is there's a tunnel there, right there. And the guy, starts laughing, and he said, we have some number of people, we're hiding in that place. It was right by the, American Air Base. And then they take us to the next door neighbor and bring us into his house and like show us some other thing that's in the wall of the main area. So, you kind of get a sense of what you're talking about in terms of what this conflict was and the difficulty of this conflict. So that was really important. I had a very extensive conversation with Madam Bin, who was the chief negotiator for the PRG. And that was really, I was surprised that they allowed that, they scheduled that for me. She was extremely interesting. She was in Paris during the negotiations the whole time for the PRG, the formal negotiations. So at one point she was very relatable. At one point I asked her, you were there all that time and you knew obviously that the real negotiations were happening between Kissinger and Le Duc. So there you are, and you are there all these years and you're not really, in those conversations. And I think I said something like, wasn't that boring? But I think I had a fancier way to say that. And she said, well, no, it wasn't boring, because what was she doing there? She was there to meet with people from the international peace movement. That's what she was there to do, and to strengthen relationships around the world. So I think at one point I actually said to her, I said, well, so when Nixon said the peace movement is falling into the arms of the National Liberation Front, he wasn't 100% wrong. But in any event, which she didn't really disagree with. But, you sort of got a sense of her role. So, it wasn't just one thing. I want to flip it for a minute, and also make sure we get to the anti-war movement, because I think that's pretty
much where we are. So, yep.
But I just want to say one thing, which is that, I did not interview many U.S. officials. I asked to interview Kissinger, and he was apparently uninterested in this conversation. I did interview Melvin Laird, but several of the interviews that I did on the American side were actually reporters, and people who had, been on the ground in Vietnam or in Cambodia. And those folks had a lot to say. It really fleshed out, made it much more obvious like what was happening. So just one simple example, again, when the U.S. Invades Cambodia, there are 3 reporters who decide that they want to see what's going on, and they're going to just get in a car and drive into Cambodia. And one of those people spoke Vietnamese. And they're as they cross the border, they're picked up, by Vietnamese troops, by North Vietnamese troops, and they're held there while their credentials are being checked, which turned out to take like 3 months for them to be that they were reporters and not CIA agents. But through those 90 days that they were there, they were traveling around Cambodia with the military, because the U.S. was bombing over the border. So they actually observed a lot from the time that they were there. And they come back and they're interested in sharing what they have learned and what they have seen with people in the State Department. And nobody's interested in talking to them, which was kind of stunning. And I think I interviewed 2 of the 3 of them that had been in that situation. So there was a lot that I learned from reporters.
Right now, turning to the anti-war movement. So
Right.
People not old enough to remember the Vietnam War may not be aware of the scale and the breadth and the depth of the anti-war movement of the 1960s and early 1970s. And the period you write about in this book is kind of, my period of anti-war activism. I graduated from high school in 1970, and I started off with my anti-war work started off with a anti-war high school underground newspaper and right around Nixon's inauguration in early 1969. And then you had the moratorium protests in the fall of 69 that drew 250,000 people to Washington, while at the same time there were other very large demonstrations in a number of cities as well. And as you wrote in the book, each passing day brought news of scheduled events in major cities as well as in many smaller towns where nobody had ever protested before. So, one of the things you mentioned early on tonight was how you really learned a lot in the course of doing this research, particularly from the declassified documents and so forth, about the impact that the anti-war movement had, really greater than we likely thought at the time. So would you like to talk a little about that?
Yes, for 10 hours. But keep it to 10 seconds. So, I mean, the biggest thing is that when Nixon comes into office, he's not going to do the thing that my class kept asking about. Why doesn't he just say the war is over and blame Johnson for it? He doesn't do that. But there is something he has to do, and Melvin Laird is a constant prod. He has to remove troops from Vietnam, which he begins doing, I think, in May or June of 1969. Why is he doing it? That's the anti-war movement. That a clear conclusion that is there from day one is that you certainly can't add more troops. I mean, that was evident, but you cannot stay having 550,000 American troops there, given what is happening politically all across the country. It was not sustainable. So Laird in particular, but Nixon, this is where being a politician did make an impact. He knew it. He knew he had to start withdrawing troops. And then the question is, at what rate would you begin doing it? And what could you get away with? And so forth and so on. But in actual, and I should also add, Kissinger never wanted to take out any troops. But that's partly because Kissinger, unlike Nixon, really didn't think about politics. He really thought about other things, but he wasn't thinking about politics. So the reality is that between, June of 69, May, June of 69, and November of 1972, Richard Nixon takes out there are 550,000 American troops when he comes in. There are probably 20 to 30,000 in November in 1972. And that means that, and those 20 to 30,000 are almost none of them are combat troops either. So he's got nothing left. So that's partly, a reason. By the time that these numbers are coming down, the president's options are steadily shrinking. But that is something he feels that he must do. Every time I remember this, and maybe it'd be interesting, other folks around this call, see what people's experience was. But every time Nixon has announced that he was taking out another 30 or 40,000 troops, everybody I know is like rolling their eyes and seeing it as another trick. Oh, just so he can bomb more. But actually, one little surprise is actually he wasn't bombing more. He actually was just in terms of the number of sorties was actually less. But we just kept thinking this is nothing. This is not significant. It was hugely significant because it meant that by the time you're in the fall of 1972, the US can't fight the war anymore. And Nixon understands that with absolute clarity. One of the things I think I said in the book, is, at the time of the presidential election in 72, the American people were polled about who do they think would be better equipped to end the war in Vietnam, George McGovern or Richard Nixon. And overwhelmingly people said, oh, well, that's Richard Nixon. And everybody I knew said, oh, that's because people are stupid. But people weren't stupid. Their relatives had come home. The fact that Nixon had withdrawn 500,000 troops from Vietnam across this country was very meaningful to people. And especially for some of us who are like in the academic world and were sort of shielded from families that had people over there, we didn't really appreciate that. But that withdrawal was us. Nixon didn't want to do it, but all of these different anti-war events that kept happening, whether it was the moratorium or whether it was, the tremendous protests around Cambodia, these vast things that happened underlined for Nixon and for Congress, and I want to swing over there a little bit, underlined that this was not sustainable. And that really made a big difference. And it did save a lot of people's lives. Probably all of us looking back on this wish we had been more effective. Right? This is a feel-good story. Right? I mean, on the American side, probably another 25,000, 28,000 Americans died. Probably 1 to 2 million Asians. So it's hard to just be self-congratulatory about that. But at the same time, there was an accomplishment. Things would have been very, very different. In the absence of an anti-war mobilization, there would not have been that troop withdrawal. There would have been an escalation. So that's very clear. And it really defines, what's going on.
It's interesting, though, because, when you discuss this in the book, sort of at the same time, you had this kind of brutal incoherence of the Nixon-Kissinger war policy by the end of 1972. I mean, again, we've talked about this before, but I was going back to school after working on the McGovern campaign full-time and losing completely, and it's December of 72, and you have that just horrific bombing of the North. And, Kissinger and Nixon and Kissinger are still thinking they can get a better deal by intimidation through bombing. And yet at the same time, they're representing themselves as peacemakers with China and the Soviet Union. So it's, both incoherent and horrifically brutal at once by that time.
Well, I don't think it's quite so incoherent. Let me just back up, because, I mean, again, this is more complex, but I do want to say something about Congress, because that's very relevant. Right? For the entire time that Nixon is president, there are resolutions being introduced in Congress that are cutting off the money and setting deadlines for troop withdrawals. And a lot of anti-war folks mobilized around that. And those resolutions always lost. And so a lot of people concluded that that this was very ineffective. But what we didn't realize, and I didn't realize it till I'm reading everything, is that part of the logic by which Nixon has to keep pulling the troops out is that he knows that if he doesn't pull the troops out, that Congress will act. And that, was an ongoing factor. It was interesting because for the UFPJ work that I did, Tom Hayden in particular, was very involved with UFPJ and very involved with the legislative work. And he really did have his eye on that dynamic. That doesn't mean if you don't get the resolution passed, in and of itself, it isn't proof that it's a failure or, for that matter, a success. But that part of what's pushing that momentum, apart from our actions in the streets, is that Congress has to keep getting persuaded not to cut the money. And they get persuaded by Nixon saying over and over, oh, okay, I'm taking another 50,000, whatever. And that goes on. And it actually culminates in November of 72. Most people who had worked on the McGovern campaign were like really, felt very disheartened by it. But actually, one thing I actually realized when I was reading the file is that McGovern had done a very important thing. He had actually consolidated the Democratic Party into an anti-war position, and that was actually pretty important. But in any event, in that, that blowout of McGovern, what we didn't notice, or at least maybe people here did, is that more anti-war members of Congress were elected that November than were in Congress before. And so what happens is about a week after the election occurs, 3 stalwart Republicans, Tower, Stennis, and maybe it was even Gerald Ford. I seem to always forget the third person. It was 3 of them. go up to the White House, and basically what they say to Nixon, it's not even base, they say to Nixon, when the new Congress comes in January, there will be no more money for the war, period. You're not going to get it. We don't have the votes anymore. So whatever Henry's doing over there in Paris, he needs to make a deal because there's no more room. And that sort of slightly ties in with Andrew, what you were talking about with respect to the bombing in December of 1972, the Christmas bombing, which was, awful, obviously. And, I think, again, many of us remember reading about that and learning about it. But it wasn't exactly incoherent, because what's going on in December, and I mean, Kissinger will say that this bombing was to get a better deal and blah, 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 and he writes 1,000 pages of memoir about that. But essentially, the story is that they know that the war is over, and that in January, when they meet with the North Vietnamese, and they fully anticipate they'll be doing that, that what they know is going to that it's over. They have to make a deal. And the aspect of the deal that had become apparent, and this had been true for many months, is that they would have to make a deal that would leave somewhere around 140,000, 150,000 North Vietnamese troops in the South. That was the only deal they could get. Russia, China, all their plans didn't materialize. That was there. So they know they have to do that. And they also know pretty well that the fact that they are going to take withdraw from the war and leave all those North Vietnamese troops in the South, which infuriated the Saigon regime, that this is a very negative result from what they had expected. And the bombing, I think, essentially was to do as much damage as they could on their way out. This is really a demonstration of American power. I don't think there's a serious thought that somehow that was going to improve the deal, which makes it even more despicable, actually. But I think that's what happened.
So not incoherent, merely brutal.
Brutal.
Well, sort of transitioning into the question and answer period from the audience hearing. Now, a question often asked when talking about past movements and what we're starting to get in the audience questions is, what are the lessons for today? People are asking, what can we learn that's relevant to the current wars from the Middle East, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, also Ukraine, and so forth. Now, for me, a half century later, this seems like a very hard question to answer, because the social and political landscape, from the polarization of wealth to the nature of media, old and new, seems so changed since the late 60s and early 70s. But having spent years in the present, immersed in the history of that past and its movements, as well as having lived through them, do you see any clear lessons that can be drawn?
Apart from all of us moving to Alaska, which we'll rule out as a possible conclusion. I don't, I know we advertise as lessons for today, and, I'm not sure that there's a set of 5 things. One thought that I have is, and again, it was really watching Kamala Harris talk about national security. And, I'm coming from a place where personally, I think, I'll end up supporting her for the 100 reasons people could think of. But I mean, her stuff about national security was just terrible. And what it really highlights, is the fact that we are facing, not just in Gaza, but we are facing a very dismal national security scene. One of the ironies, I think, of this, and in some ways I wish we could have more of a discussion with everybody. One of the ironies is that because Donald Trump has become anointed himself a peace dove, right? And he says things in the debate like, well, we should be worried about nuclear war, right? I mean, he's just getting those sentences out. Or, why are we spending all that money on weapons, right? Because he's taken that position. It's actually made the national discussion worse, right? Because he's like, oh, well, this is less relevant to Gaza than it is to Ukraine and to NATO and our relationship with China and all of it. We have a very frozen national discussion going on. I don't think that that's true of Gaza, and I can recognize a lot of folks on the call, and all of us doing things to try to affect that. But I mean, the thing that is clear to me is that the whole direction of US policy, if it's going to be changed, that is going to require a mass mobilization. And how we do that, I don't have any magic answers to it except to say that that's what is actually going to be needed, because I don't think that Kamala Harris, whatever her many virtues, and I think she has many virtues actually, but I don't think she's coming in as somebody that's going to take a fresh look at the direction, that we're moving in. So, I mean, that's one takeaway. A second takeaway, which is kind of implicit in what I'm saying about my research, is I do think it's very important to work with Congress, and that remains a very important, area of activity, even if things don't go well. But the effort to move Congress to take better positions remains important. However, I want to put the however here, because I think, and to some extent, this ties into the work that I did as legislative coordinator for UFPJ with my friend Gail Murphy, who I think is on this call, and also my friend Sue Udry, who is our staff person, which is as important as the congressional work is, and the lobbying and understanding what bills are important and what to focus on. None of that happens without a mass mobilization. That those two things have to go together. That what is going to make a member of Congress listen? And some people, I think, have the view, if we just send very intelligent people up to talk to, less intelligent people in Congress, and we have really good arguments and good reasons, they're going to be so impressed with us. No, certainly not where you have vested interests involved. So and I think when we initially were doing this work with UFPJ on Iraq, which we did for many years, with a number of folks who are on this call playing a big role in that, that part of our ability to do that, was because there was a mass movement. And I'm noticing in this call, Scott Kammel, who played a very, very important role in the military side of this. And we haven't really talked about that, and the tremendous organizing that was going on among Vietnam vets, and even going on in Vietnam, because that's another piece of that story, that of like, what are the things that enabled us to finally end what's happening in Southeast Asia. And I just want to, express my admiration to Scott and the people that did all that really important work. But again, I think one lesson of it is that we have to try to tie congressional work into work that's happening at the base. And that's true with regard to Gaza, and it's true with regard to the military budget and a nuclear policy, that if we can't build visible opposition at the same time as we do our lobbying and campaigning or whatever, then that actually doesn't work. So, I mean, to me, that's one of the really important lessons.
Yeah, and I would add, also trying to build and sustain peace organizations for the long term. A really striking moment for me was, right before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when the votes were coming up. My organization's offices are in Oakland, California, and our representative there was Barbara Lee at that time. But I live the other side of the Bay Area hills in the district of a congressperson named Ellen Tauscher. And on successive days in the run-up to the war, when the votes were about to be made that were relevant to the war, I stood with Barbara Lee and maybe 40 representatives of Bay Area, inner Bay Area community organizations supporting her opposition to the war. Next day, I'm in a swing district, the other side of the hills, with the 7 or 8 people we could get together to go talk to Ellen Tauscher, and she's kind of temporizing and said, "Oh, I don't know. I think it's a loser. The minister has so much power," and so forth. Now, it's not something in the water in the inner San Francisco Bay Area. It's the accretion of many generations now of movements that have left some kind of at least a minimal sustainable trace here. So we have a couple of questions that are related to the bombing. We have one from another person who's been around doing this stuff for a long time, John Isaacs, who says, "Years after the Vietnam War ended, I ran into a number of CIA people who declared that the US could have won or at least avoided the humiliating withdrawal of US troops, except that Congress cut off the funding for bombing in and around Indochina." Does that make any sense to you, basically?
Well,
And the other one, and maybe you can answer these both at once, is that this person says the reason why Congress cut off funding or bombing in and around Indochina was because of the Watergate scandal. Is that true? So
no,
perhaps you can address those two questions about
it's not true. Just the second one is easier than the first. Congress cut off the, I mean, the Congress cut off that money, but they hadn't known, right? I mean, this is actually, that after the peace agreement is signed in January of 1973, most people thought, oh, well, the war is over. And even members of Congress kind of did. And it actually, that the extent of the bombing, it was a double revelation, actually, because it was a revelation about what had happened from spring of 1969 to June of 1970, right? That Nixon had been bombing Cambodia all along, which had been kept a secret. And also that it was kind of hidden that after the agreement was signed in January of 73, the US was continuing to bomb Cambodia. And the combined revelations of that really made people furious. And it seemed incredibly stupid. Like there was no point at that. You weren't going to prove anything once the US had withdrawn from Vietnam, other than that. So I think that was kind of, I think Watergate was really independent of that. There's an ironic thing, which is that at the time of the Watergate hearings, which came much later, that members of Congress, like John Conyers, as a case in point, Elizabeth Holtzman, they actually wanted to have as one of the articles of impeachment that Nixon's illegal bombing of Cambodia. But there was an article of impeachment, which was then killed by Peter Rodino because he wanted something bipartisan. And ironically, one of the things that John Conyers and others said back then was, we don't have anything about Cambodia or any of this. This will all get buried and people will just think that the worst thing that ever happened was breaking into the Democratic headquarters, So it was really a debate about that. So, okay, so that's the easy question. I think I think that they would have cut off the money. I'm sneaking back to John Isaac. So he's done so much work on Congress and is such a great resource for the anti-war movement. I don't think there's the slightest indication they would have won. And I don't think that they thought so. There's really is, one of the things that I spend more time on in the book, which sort of surprised a lot of people, is Laos and Lamps on 719, which was something actually I don't think I ever paid any attention to. Some people might have, right? Which is in the spring, well, actually even in the sort of end of winter, 1971. So keep in mind that the presidential election is looming. This big operation is planned, which is going to be the first time that large numbers of South Vietnamese troops are going to go into Laos. And the goal there is to stay in Laos at a certain location and cut off the ability of the enemy to infiltrate troops into South Vietnam. That's the goal of it. And this is going to be the first time that the South Vietnamese army is going to be doing it by themselves, although they are going to have American air support. And that is a total disaster. a complete disaster. You know, and it's kind of a 10-part disaster that is happening in terms of all the things that are going wrong. And for some amount of time, Nixon and Kissinger are kind of in denial about that. But then, in fact, among other things, the leader of South Vietnam, tells all the troops to leave. No, we're going home. He was supposed to be keeping those troops there for 3 more months, and they're there for about 2 days. And so that's the moment of truth for Nixon and Kissinger, that's the moment that they really see that the South Vietnamese army is ineffective. And if they had any doubts about that, when you go then to the spring of 1972, when there is then a North Vietnamese offensive into South Vietnam, and at that point as well, there's not that many US soldiers there, so the South Vietnamese are carrying the burden. The perception of Nixon and Kissinger and of others is that these troops, these South Vietnamese troops, are ineffective, and that the only thing that had prevented a complete takeover of South Vietnam at that point was American air power. So that's why I'm saying, they really did not have hopes of anything. That's part of what, and of course, they were still involved in this troop removal, right? Because we're going down. We have 150,000. Now we have 100. That's also taking place. But the combination of that and their perception of South Vietnamese weakness, that's really where they're coming from on that. There's no sense that any kind of victory is in sight.
Yeah, really, one of the other very strong things about the book is your coverage of the just devastation and disruption of the societies in Laos and in Cambodia from the US military operations there, many of them secret and kept from the American people and much of the American government for a considerable length of time. And we have a audience question, who is kind of pointing this up, and we had that. Then you had the rise of Pol Pot, and they're asking, has Cambodia really recovered from all of that even now?
But that was really a process of Cambodia being completely destabilized and ripped apart. You know what? I read the book of those 3 reporters because they wrote a book about their experience. And as I said, I interviewed 2 of the 3, about their experience. And it's especially when I was doing those interviews, I had the words of Daniel Ellsberg, in my head, you'll become a kind of moron. And part of what these people who are on the other side, on inside Cambodia as the American bombing is going on and the invasion, they're there. I shouldn't say bombing, right? Of the invasion of South Vietnam troops and American troops. They're talking about a society being ripped apart. They're seeing it, and no one wants to hear it because they're, who are they? And I mean, there's so many instances of that, that people in power blinded themselves.
Well, we have another question from the audience, which may be a good place to begin to wrap up, which is, should we have a tighter leash on our military? And of course, I think one of the messages of your book is it takes a really big movement to build that tighter leash. So.
Right, and it's not the military. I mean, again, I wish when I was writing the book, I didn't even have that word, the blob. But and it doesn't sound very academic anyway. So Oxford probably wouldn't. Oh, this is a book about the blob, but it's the blob. This is these networks of bureaucracies, right? It's the CIA. It's different branches of the military. It's large portions of the State Department and the people. It's these people in think tanks that interact all the time with the people, in Washington, and even to some degree we have journalists that are all kind of part of this apparatus. It's very overwhelming. And I'm not saying that to be, just pessimistic, because I think all of us have to keep acting. But and somehow it was really a moment of truth listening to Kamala Harris, say these. She didn't even say the word diplomacy in that presentation, right? I'm sure she was warned that you're a woman, you have to show that you're powerful. But it really is a reminder in terms of where we are right now as a country, what our foreign policy is, of how formidable the situation is. I mean, as well as the situation with in Gaza and the relationship of the administration to Netanyahu. Now, fortunately, we do have a movement around those issues, right? I mean, people are in the streets. There, many things happening. It just needs to get stronger. I don't think people are being stupid. I think people are doing the best they can. But I think in terms of the overall approach of what our national security policy is, there's nothing that's going to change that. You can elect this person or that person. You need to have a mass movement that can begin to counteract these things.
Indeed. Well, Rusti, you were a long time stalwart of the United for Peace and Justice Coordinating Committee, and we really appreciate your contributions. And maybe you could reflect a bit about your work with United for Peace and Justice and what you found valuable there.
Well, first of all, just speaking personally, I've seen Gail Murphy writing me questions. I think Sue Udry is wandering around. I mean, look, one thing that was really valuable. So just to go back, I would say somewhere like in 2004, United for Peace and Justice, actually had money and set up a whole legislative program where we were able to hire a staff person, namely Sue Udry, who was great. And then there were two of us who were coordinators. I was from a local group and Gail Murphy was from Code Pink, so we could do that work. But so personally, that was very rewarding. But more practically, one of the things that was very meaningful back then and that I think was effective was at that time, United for Peace and Justice had pretty strong ties, not just to major national groups, but to local groups all across the country. That's really an important thing that UFPJ did. So that when we're talking about legislative strategy, it wasn't like three of us in a room, but we were able to have conference calls, with people from local groups across the country. And again, we have some national groups that do this. I mean, obviously, Peace Action is excellent at that and, have affiliates. But there are many, many unaffiliated local groups. And when there were resources for United for Peace and Justice, it was really possible to really, again, we didn't exactly stop the war single-handedly, but we did affect Iraq policy, which is a whole other, another hour and a half about what things we did accomplish during that time. And so we were talking about money. And I said I was happy to raise money for United for Peace and Justice. Not only because it was a very positive experience working with them in the past, but because there are certain aspects of the organization that are really very important in the present, which includes trying to link international policy, national security matters with domestic concerns, which many other organizations really aren't doing, and that's very meaningful. Additionally, UFPJ still retains, many connections to local groups that are not affiliates of anybody. So it has the capacity, to do more, going as it goes forward. And I think the bottom line is that UFPJ was able to do a lot more in the past when there was money and, to do those things. And I think it's important that UFPJ be able to continue and be able to pay for staff and to do that work of linking, and also including much more of a focus on nuclear danger, which often gets lost in the shuffle. So I feel like it really has made a major contribution, since 2002, and it has the capacity to continue to be a constructive force. So I hope people will, consider making a donation so that work can go forward.
Yeah, as someone who has attempted to raise money for both national and international peace networks over the last several decades, one of the things that the big funders are just do not understand as networks. And yet networks really are one of the ways you can really leverage the power of community groups around the country and around the world, and allow them to get in touch with each other and work together more effectively and so forth. And all of the networks I've been involved with have been mainly sustained by small donations. So anything makes a difference. So George, you want to bring us to a close here?
To a close. Thank you so much, Rusti. I learned a lot, and it's given me the energy to know that if we continue to build a movement that is strong, we can influence Congress.
Oh, yeah.
Which I really, probably felt was not possible, but you have made me a believer. And
Richard Nixon made me a believer.
All right then. And the 64 people that joined us when we were at our height, and the 52 that are here now, thank each and every one of you. And we appreciate that you will get there with us and be part of our network to strengthen the movement and force Congress to do what they should, and that you will, throw something in the collection plate or the hat that's being passed around or whatever.
George, can I just say one last thing here? I just want to thank you for inviting me. And, as I'm looking at various names that are coming up here, many of the folks here are people I've worked with and are old friends, and it's actually a privilege to be able to do this talk. So thank you.
Thank you. And I think my mute button was on when I was saying thank you for letting me know that there is pause to trust.
We heard you, George.
Oh, good. And everyone is going to participate. You'll hear from us after this. You'll get the recording and be invited to become a member if you're not in a member group. And from your local organization to a national organization, build those networks, because we will have work to do in the future. And we will not, turn our back. We will face whatever we have to face together. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Good night.
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 Bye.